Greetings sailors, and welcome to a first look at the USS Massachusetts, an upcoming Tier 8 American premium battleship, which is another South Dakota. We already have one of these in-game, in form of the Alabama, but there are some differences with this ship, and it is rather unlike the form that it first came into the game in, because it's been being tested and tweaked and worked on for the better part of a year already. Now, I don't know when this is going to come out, only other than it's going to be in the near future sometime, but we have been told that this ship is ready to review and it's basically in its final state. So, barring any extremely last-minute changes, this should be the ship as it gets released. So what is there to differentiate this from the Alabama? Well, a couple of key factors. The two headlines really are that it has much longer range secondaries, 7.5 base range secondary guns, and they actually have 40% better accuracy to start with before you've done anything to help that along. And the other is that the guns are, the main batteries are theoretically inferior to both the Alabama and the North Carolina, only it's not quite clear cut for really either of those characteristics. And I'll say right at the top of the video here, if you want a brawling premium battleship, the Tirpitz is still, in my opinion, much superior to this, just because of the nature of its secondary guns, and also the nature of the German armour generally. But this is still not a bad ship. In fact, in a lot of ways, this is quite a fun ship. And as I said, both of the headlines are not quite as clear-cut as they first seem. So there is potentially a reason to get this rather than the Alabama, if you don't already say have an Alabama or you particularly fancy the look of this. If you don't have either of them, this would certainly be an attractive option, but the Alabama maybe has some things going for it that this doesn't. So I'm going to start off by talking about the secondaries. This isn't going to be like my other first look videos especially. I'm going to be particularly comparing this to the Alabama and the North Carolina, and just looking very specifically at the stats on this ship and not necessarily comparing it to all the other battleships. So in all three games, you're going to basically see this ship with maximum secondary range, which is 11.3 kilometers. And in this particular one, we're starting off with a manual secondaries captain along with AFT. And I didn't have a good enough US captain to have 3 4-point skills on, so I had to pick and choose, but fortunately Wargaming was generous enough to give some doubloons for respecking captains several times over, so I could actually test things out a bit. And I've heavily edited all 3 replays that you're going to see, although the third one a bit less so, but this one is really just to demonstrate the extreme accuracy of the secondary guns. It's not going to be a particularly high damage secondary game, but with the secondary module, which gives you both accuracy and range and manual secondaries, these things are pinpoint accurate. They are ridiculously accurate for secondary guns. And that's especially bad news for cruisers and destroyers. But the real downside of these secondary guns is that they are 5-inch US guns. They're basically the same guns you find on the destroyers and the secondaries of other US battleships, and of course the Atlanta as well. And it's 10 barrels per side, so you know it's a pretty decent number overall. But because it's a US ship, it has a smaller penetration number than the German secondary HE gets, and they're kind of reasonably low fire chance as well, those 5-inch guns. I think is it 4%, 5% of the base fire chance? I don't even know if I made a note of that, but it's fairly low. So you're more relying on direct damage done from the guns themselves than setting a lot of fires, because the fire chance just isn't really there. You don't quite have enough guns to be reliably setting a lot of fires, unlike the German battleships. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. You've got this extreme accuracy, but at the same time, if you want your secondaries to be the best they can be, you really have to spec into it very hard. And in fact I will discuss captain builds a little bit later on, but in this case I was finding, lots of accuracy but not getting necessarily huge amounts of damage. And I think although manual secondaries is kind of tempting, it's maybe not one that's necessary overall. I think the base accuracy that's already extremely good to begin with, along with the accuracy you're getting from the secondary module for the extra range, is more than good enough. You don't really need that extra laser accuracy of the manual secondary skill. And it almost has a downside, as I've found. Even with IFHE, and the next replay that you'll see is actually AFT and IFHE, you are more effective at damaging cruisers and destroyers. And I did some training room testing with this as well, particularly. But I discovered, even with IFHE, with the accuracy that you have at close ranges against other battleships particularly, they tend to very tightly cluster and derp into the hull where they're not doing any damage. And so you really need to be at longer ranges for them to be effective against other battleships and to get those arcing hits into the superstructure, which is where they are going to do damage. So for extreme close ranges, and we're talking, say, 5 kilometers or less, in fact probably more like 4 kilometers or less, the effectiveness of these against other battleships really does drop right down, but they still remain quite effective against cruisers and destroyers in particular. So it really is a mixed bag with these guns. The range is impressive, the accuracy is very impressive, but it's not impressive across all ranges, if that makes any sense. And with IFHE especially, you are sort of relying on RNG to hit those areas where it will actually pen. And even then, because of the small caliber of the guns, there are targets that you will struggle to get any damage out of with the secondaries. However, this is where we come to talking about the main battery. And this replay is nearly done, by the way. There was, unfortunately, from my point of view, we had the superior map control, so we were easily winning on points, but there was just so much damage left on the table to do, and no time in which to do it. So anyway, we're about to win this one on points, as you can see. I also have put up the damage scorecard for a little bit longer, so you'll get to see that I didn't do a huge amount of damage overall with secondaries in this one. It was about half and half between the Leander and the destroyer, but if you've got a destroyer at close range, then actually, yeah, getting accurate hits and a decent amount of damage out of them is going to be very, very useful indeed. And they are much more effective at close range, and this is something I've got to say. Having tried to get on to talking about the main battery, I'm already backsliding to talking about the secondaries. The fact that they are slow velocity 5-inch US shells means that at the longer ranges as well, even with the extra accuracy, the game or the automatic gunnery, I don't know how to put it exactly, it doesn't seem to quite give enough lead almost. So I found that for longer ranges, and especially against quicker targets, they were able to dodge out of the way almost of the secondary hits without that much difficulty because of the long flight time of those shells. So again, absolutely a mixed bag with these secondaries. So the main battery, 1.7 Sigma, which is not good. In fact, if you look at the main battery stats generally, the one thing it has improved over the North Carolina and the Alabama is a 36-second turret rotation time for going from one side of the ship to the other, 180 degrees. The Alabama's already pretty decent at 40 seconds. North Carolina is fairly standard at 45. So this is quite good. 36 seconds means you do not need expert marksman as a skill on this ship. And if you do have it, you can get it down to, 32 seconds, something like that. If you have your John Doe captain, you can actually get it down to a flat 30 seconds. So you could take that skill And actually having a very quick turret rotation is going to be extremely useful when you are brawling in this thing, which you know you'll kind of want to do if you can possibly get away with it, because that's where you'll have the most fun for the most part. But just playing it like a normal US battleship is still more than possible. So, faster turret traverse, but the downsides are 18.3 kilometers range, and I found myself using the spotter plane quite often. You can of course take the plotting room modification for the extra 16%, which will put you over just over 21 kilometers, but at that point of course you're giving up your secondaries module, and I think even if you are not going for a full secondary spec on your captain, you probably still will want to keep that module even so. So 1.7 Sigma on the guns. You've got also the horizontal dispersion value given in game is where is it, 200 and something. I've written that down somewhere. 242 meters. All of these things look alarmingly similar to the Dunkirk's guns. The only real difference between them at first glance is the fact that the Dunkirk has 13-inch guns and this has 16-inch guns. However, in practice, these guns absolutely do not behave like the Dunkirk's guns. They're maybe not nearly as reliable as the North Carolina with its 2.0 Sigma, but the thing is, Sigma isn't everything. The entire mechanic of dispersion in this game is certainly one of the more complex areas of it, and possibly one of the hardest ones to understand overall. But there are a bunch of different factors going on, and when you're just looking in the port, it can actually be quite hard to tell, looking at the numbers given in the client, whether your ship is going to be accurate or not. And when you look at it, and when you look at a site that gives you some of the hidden stats, it seems like actually no, this shouldn't really be an accurate ship at all. But there is actually one extra thing going on, and that is the minimum dispersion stats, and basically the smallest possible circle, or well, no, it will be the smallest possible circle in which your guns can hit, because it's impossible for like everything to hit exactly on the reticle. I mean, well, I say impossible, it's extremely unlikely. Anyway, the Sigma value itself is how close shells will tend to cluster towards the center of the circle, and when you look at people testing themselves in training rooms, you know, you have to be firing a lot of volleys before you can start to pick up a accurate picture of what it's going to look like. Individual volleys, kind of neither here nor there. But when you throw the dispersion figures in, and especially those minimum dispersion figures, the dispersion itself isn't bad, but the minimum dispersion figures are significantly better than either of the two the brother ships of this thing, or sister ships, I don't know, the two siblings. Let's just go with the non-gendered version, shall we? And that does seem to really make up for this 1.7 Sigma. These guns feel rather more accurate than 1.7 Sigma would suggest, or rather more reliable, let's put it that way, than 1.7 Sigma would suggest. So, personally, when it comes down to when you're choosing how to play this thing, really you have several options. You can do that secondary spec IFHE build, and this is IFHE by the way, but the IFHE was more hitting battleships, which I was just finding less effective overall. It does seem to absolutely do its best work against destroyers and cruisers, and again you'll see that on the scorecards at the end. But aside from that, you know, just the main battery I was finding quite reliable overall. So yeah, you can go for that full secondary spec and you will get results out of it. And having watched some other people's videos of this, and you know, seen the kind of results they've gotten out of it, it's possible to get some very good extra damage figures out of those secondary guns in the right circumstances. But it's also perfectly viable just to play it like a standard US survivable battleship build. It still works rather well with that. And then of course you also have the option of just going full AA spec. That is also extremely viable as an option, just as much so as with the North Carolina and the Alabama. In fact, it has the exact same long-range AA suite as those two ships. So this was the close-range fight in this particular game. One thing I did notice with the secondaries, though, and I keep coming back to them, but they are such a big factor on this ship, is you have to be quite broadside to get all of them firing. Most of the time you're not going to get all of them firing, and so being broadside in a US battleship, you know, against most targets, it's a bad idea. So a lot of the time I wasn't getting the full benefit of all of them going off at once, and with a German battleship I probably would have had more effectiveness. But still, you know, those times when you do get to use them can be quite fun. It's just, overall, personally, I think I would just spec this out and play it like a standard US battleship. And at that point, you might as well get an Alabama. Although, the extra base range, you know, even if you completely ignore secondaries, you've still got 7.5 kilometers base range, which is not terrible at all. So, you have some options with this ship. I think that's honestly one of the most interesting things about the Massachusetts, is you genuinely have a choice about how you're going to do it. And even if that choice involves entirely ignoring those secondary guns, it's still a very playable ship. It's still quite a reasonably reliable ship in terms of its main battery. I mentioned towards the start of the video that I said, you know, if you want a ship to derp around in with secondaries, get a Tirpitz. But the thing is, then you've got the German main batteries to contend with, which are notoriously not very reliable. So that's the difference really between this and the Tirpitz, excluding, you know, torpedoes, obviously, is that may have by far the better secondaries and more reliable secondaries overall. But this definitely has the better feeling main battery. They're bigger guns, you get more of them, even just, you know, pointing forward. Overall, it's only one more barrel, and of course the Tirpitz does fire faster. But just having more guns, having bigger guns, and in theory, you know, not that accurate, but in practice, accurate enough guns. Yeah, that's quite a nice, you know, differentiation, if you want to put it that way, between this and the Tirpitz. You've got a choice between, you can have something that's incredibly hard to citadel and very good secondaries versus something that's a lot easier to citadel but has much more reliable main batteries, even though theoretically it shouldn't. It's that minimum dispersion distance that seems to make the difference, unless there's even more hidden numbers that you know, in play. Hell, even things, and this is how kind of complicated it can get with talking about accuracy of main batteries, even things like the shell velocity have an effect, because it's a US battleship. It has slow US battleship shells. That does actually have an effect on, I think it's specifically the vertical dispersion. So there's all these different little pieces going into it. It's not especially an easy thing. I might even put in a link down below where there's an explanation of kind of sigma versus dispersion from, I think it was Little White Mouse. I believe it was. Anyway, so 160k damage that time. A pretty good game overall. You'd have seen me doing reasonably well against broadside cruisers in you know, the first game as well. I actually deleted a rather unwary hipper, and again in this game, you know, I cannot complain about the main battery. I found the main battery to be more than adequate. So if you choose to ignore the secondaries entirely, this is still a pretty decent ship. And some people might not enjoy the fact that it's only got that 18.3 kilometer main battery range. In which case, you know, you can just go for the 16% upgrade and get it to over 20, or I still even found it perfectly playable just using the spotter plane for that extra boost every so often. And I'm personally one of those battleship players that doesn't necessarily need all the range in the world. And you can kind of see where Wargaming is going with that, not giving it all the range in the world, because you know, the North Carolina, in comparison with the range upgrade, you can get up to, what, 27 kilometers, something like that. The base is over 23. So having less range is hopefully going to encourage people not to be sailing around all the time at maximum range. And sometimes, you know, these numbers are good enough. 18.3 kilometers is good enough. And on this ship, the 1.7 Sigma, coupled with that dispersion value, is good enough. So, last game, the previous two games were both tier 8 to top tier. This is a tier 10 game. I'm going to see how it holds up in a tier 10 game, because you will be seeing tier 10s reasonably often. And in this case, I don't know that I was actually playing as well as the previous two games, but I sort of get away with it a little bit. But I think that is at least in part at various times in this game where people are focusing on ships other than me. And if they'd been focusing on me more, I probably would have had a far rougher time. One thing I should mention, by the way, is that the camo, what's the word I'm looking for? The surface detection of this ship is exactly the same as the Alabama, 16.6 base, 16.1 with the camo that comes with it. So that's worse than the North Carolina. And if you are going for a full secondary spec, of course, that means giving up Concealment Expert potentially. In fact, if you are going for the whole hog, it does mean giving up Concealment Expert. So it's a bit of a hefty penalty to pay, but you can still sort of make it work. But I think personally, I would just go with Concealment. I'd go with the standard battleship captain and go for survivability if I was to have one of these things. And bearing in mind, I don't have an Alabama. And as somebody who doesn't have an Alabama, this ship looks reasonably attractive to me. So anyway, tier 10 game, Islands of Ice, and as you can see there's a whole blob of enemy ships moving down to the A cap. And I've decided to slow down here near some allies to shoot these ships that are going down towards A, but it's not a great position overall. This is me just seeing broadside stuff and going, ooh, I want to shoot at that. And maybe not paying quite enough attention to my positioning and where I'm potentially leaving myself open to. And this is slightly bolstered by the fact that I've got some allies here as well. There's Montana, slightly to the south of me, Chapayev, and that Frida Togrosa, who may or may not be only just waking up, I'm not sure. Our team, meanwhile, well, we've gotten the C cap. The C cap. The enemy's going to the C cap. We've gotten the A cap. Yes, I can absolutely tell the difference between the first three letters of the alphabet. Well done, me. So yeah, most of our team has kind of gone there, and we're now sort of pushing out, but not really. Crucially, we do have the B cap, though. It's come at some cost to our destroyers, but the fact that we have the two caps at the moment does give us this kind of early lead, which is maybe going to be useful later on, but we'll see. So this is the part where, maybe I should have been paying more attention. Maybe I should have been thinking, you know what, it's been long enough that a destroyer might have popped up to our south and put up some torpedoes against these barely moving battleships. And lo and behold, that's exactly what an enemy destroyer did. And I got kind of lucky in that I only took 2 of them. So that could have been, you know, a lot nastier. That was just me straight up not paying enough attention to what was going on around me. Which you can't really afford to do in World of Warships, especially not in a battleship and there's destroyers around and you're a nice stationary target. That is absolutely an invitation to have bad things happen to you. So now is the time to withdraw, and I was backing up. I think, just about at the point of having the thought of, maybe I should move when that load of torpedoes came at my face. So I was just about having that thought, but I was having it much, much too late, and it could have cost me a lot worse than it did. So now there's this great big mass of enemy ships to shoot at, but who are also shooting at me, although not all at me. And this is the part where I'm kind of lucky that I'm with an ally, because a lot of them are focusing that Montana right now. You'll also notice a thing in this replay, maybe, and possibly you'll have noticed it in the previous replays, that I haven't yet mentioned. What the kind of final little extra thing that Wargaming added to encourage people to get up close and personal. That is in fact the heal. When this first came out, they actually made it have a really long cooldown on its damage control party, which they then reverted to just being a standard one. At the same time, though, they decreased the use time on the heal, which I believe is it 80 seconds standard on most ships? On this ship, it is 60 seconds, and if you use the premium version, it's 40 seconds between uses. So if there was ever a ship to not skimp and use the premium version of the heal, it's this one. 40 seconds between uses of a heal is incredibly potent as a tool, and it lets you get away with far more and survive situations where you're getting pelted with a lot of damage far better than other ships could cope with. Don't ask me what the Chapayev is doing in this game, by the way. I mean, I know I wasn't playing the best, but the Chapayev just seemed to be, I don't know, determined not to move away from that one particular iceberg. And the phj.wotreplays is sort of now belatedly moving north as well, but I've just been in full flight the entire time and hoping that I won't get focused too hard. I can't remember which exact captain setup I had in this game, but this match is much more about the longer range gunfire. I only just get into secondary range of somebody right towards the end. In fact, this might have been one of the earlier games I played where I just put my Iowa captain in as is, and although I would have had the upgraded secondary module, I won't have had the captain skills, I don't think, because I'm pretty sure I just have general survivability on my Iowa captain. So, some nice broadside targets to shoot at. Approaching 100k damage again. I really didn't find it difficult to get 100k damage plus, even without the aid of the secondaries, you know, just from the main battery damage. Which is good news when you're playing a premium ship. You want to do the damage because the damage is going to get you the credits. You know, I didn't even really talk about how all this does as a premium, and honestly, overall, as a credit-making ship, this is probably better than something like the Tirpitz just because of that main battery reliability. And, you know, the harder-hitting nature of those main batteries. Hell, even comparing it to the Key, which is the other premium at this tier, which has 16-inch guns, it's definitely a more reliable hitter than the Key. And the Key's gimmick of having that really strong AA, in fact having basically the best AA for a tier 8 battleship, it doesn't really come into play that often. And, you know, you could say the same about going for an AA spec on the US battleships. They take it very well, but it's not going to be useful that often. If you're going for either just the general survivability battleship build or a full secondary build, those are going to come into play a lot more often. And really it comes down to, I think, playstyle and personal preferences at that stage, which you want to do exactly. So although we are quite close on numbers, in fact the enemy team has more ships, we're still just ahead on points from having and holding that cap. And although the group of ships that I was with are basically now all dead, there were enough enemy ships that were pursuing them up the map that they've actually basically ignored taking the B cap. And also at the same time they've been giving our team on the other side of the B cap something to shoot at. So as a distraction, this wasn't terrible, but I think overall I certainly could have been better and more effective in this game just in terms of my positioning, and certainly I could have been better in terms of just paying attention to what the hell was going on around me. But given that this is a tier 10 game, I feel like I'm doing not too badly, and certainly this damage output is not too bad at all. And honestly, some classes are better to be down tiered in others. I think battleships overall, it depends on the exact tiers. You know, being a tier 6 battleship in a tier 8 game can be kind of rough, but not as rough as being a tier 6 cruiser in a tier 8 game or a tier 8 cruiser in a tier 10 game. And it really does depend on the the exact circumstances that the matchmaker gives you. But yeah, overall, I generally feel a lot more confident in a Tier 8 battleship in a Tier 8 10 game than I would under certain other circumstances. So I'm just trying to help finish off this Dakotas. There's also Bismarck, and there's still, it seems like, a bunch of enemy ships around sea. So even though the enemy team theoretically has the upper hand in terms of numbers, their positioning is bad enough and their teamwork is deficient enough that we are going to quite comfortably win this one in terms of points. I do still have the chance to get a little bit more damage out of it, so we'll get to see that as well. Now, normally towards the end of these videos, I would take a look at the armour scheme, but again, it's an Alabama. I don't think the armour is in any way different from the Alabama. It's all around the guns and the secondaries, and of course the heel as well as the other main difference. So it basically comes down to, if you have an Alabama and maybe, let's say, you already have a Tirpitz, I honestly can't see a reason to buy this instead. If you don't have either of those ships and you want a secondary brawler, I would say get a Tirpitz. But if you want something that has a much more reliable main battery than the Tirpitz, then absolutely this is a good choice. And you couple that with the short cooldown on being able to use your heal, then it's not an unattractive ship overall. It certainly offers something, or a combination of factors of stats. That's not quite the word I wanted there, but it offers a combination that you don't quite find elsewhere, which you know, is not a bad thing for a premium ship. And in a way, all of the hoo-ha about the Alabama coming into the game in the first place has maybe been beneficial for the eventual form that the Massachusetts has taken, because we can imagine that if the NA community hadn't kicked up that ruckus about wanting the Alabama in the game, which was originally intended just to be a ship for super testers, we would have had the Massachusetts come out and it would have just been basically the Alabama, and instead we get something different and interesting and actually quite fun. So it's one of those weird butterfly effect things where it actually, you know, turned out to be beneficial overall in terms of the ship that you get to play as the end result. So I'm a bit rusty at this, haven't done it in a while, but hopefully this gave you enough information to help inform your decision whether you want to buy this thing or not. I will, of course, encourage you to go out and watch other people's videos and read other people's reviews as well. I very rarely think it's a good idea just to take one person's word for a thing. It's good to get a range of opinions and see what people think of a ship from different points of view. But yeah, overall, I quite like it. I think most other people that have reviewed it so far recently probably, you know, not going to be wholly in disagreement with me in terms of my assessment. And so, yeah, overall it seems like a pretty decent Tier 8 premium, and it seems like one that could add something to your port that you don't have already, potentially. So hopefully you have found this video useful, and if you have, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.